Patrik Antonius is a former male model, former professional tennis player, and now he's a high-stakes poker player. In the hand we have this week, he makes a huge river raise in this high-stakes cash game. That guy's life could not be better.
Also, he does it against Brian Townsend, one of the internet wizards of a few years ago, and a great high-stakes player himself.
Yeah, pretty good stuff.
It's good stuff indeed. This hand was recommended to us, though, by iHeartGoddess Davi on Twitter. If you have a suggestion for us, get on your Twitter machines and tweet at us.
And now it's like, even if he was good, he's so fragile.
Emotional.
Call for six, call for six.
Yeah.
And Brian Townsend with Queen Jack.
3,300.
He's going to buy
Pushing it
himself.
up.
Pass.
Yeah, he's going to buy himself the button with that raise and take control of this pot.
3,003.
He's also got rid of Phil Ivey. Just leaves Patrik Antonius. Is he going to call to try and catch a set? There's your answer.
You know, of course, the problem with calling a raise against an aggressive player like this, even if you hit your six, you might not win a big pot.
No, it's just push pot.
Exactly.
Because Brian Townsend doesn't necessarily have to have a big hand. And here's an example. And this is actually a monster. Brian Townsend has top pair. Patrik Antonius has a set.
This other group of girls, this looks like.
How much money is Brian Townsend really going to lose with just Queen Jack here? You can look at the percentages. 98% for Patrik Antonius.
I thought they were
8,000.
charging me $5.
$8,000 bet for Brian Townsend.
This guy's F this, F that, F that.
Called.
It looks like he calls this.
And in Europe, it's
Pot is about $23,000 to the turn.
Wait till you go to Germany.
King of
You see what they
hearts.
have after like 5
Doesn't really change anything.
Really?
The bet's $20,000.
Yeah, 2-1.
Pot is now $43,000.
2002, right?
20,000 to Patrik. Patrik, the Iceman.
Yeah, but you were down 1-0, and then they ejected a Brazilian player.
20,000's called.
He just calls. I think that's probably his best chance of getting on in this pot once that king's come down.
5.
So Townsend makes an interesting bet here on the turn, even with the king coming, and I think it's because he's pretty sure that there are almost no kings in Antonius's range.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense when you really break down Antonius's range that he would call the flop with. It is possible that he would call with a hand as bad as ace high, because Townsend is an active player and Antonius might think ace high is good on the flop. King high is stretching it a little bit.
Yeah.
Antonius really does not have king jack, king 10, king 9, those types of hands very often at all. He really doesn't have king 6 or king 5 suited, which are now 2-pair too often. It's a lot more likely that he would have ace 5 or ace 6 suited.
Correct.
So it seems that Townsend is targeting specifically just a 5 or just a 6, usually ace 5, ace 6 suited, or 6, 7, 5, 7, 4, 5, one of those types of hands.
7, 8, yeah. Also, there's I don't even know that Antonius is really calling with that many ace highs on the flop. It's possible, but probably not too many. But also there are some bad queens that Antonius can have, which Townsend is still ahead of too, and he's just trying to get value from all of them.
Right. It seems that the majority of Antonius's range is behind Townsend, making this a pretty good value
How do
bet.
you play the river, though?
Last card.
Out of position. Almost hoping for a queen or a jack to come. Well, that's not it. That's a 4 diamonds. Patrik Antonius trying to decide how to play this. He's going to check it. And Brian Townsend does like to value bet his marginal holdings. It's one black chip, but a lot of red chips. And it's a $40,000 bet. $40,000 bet into a $63,000 pot. The pot's $103,000. And at this point, if you're Patrik Antonius, do you raise? Or do you put maybe, are you scared of queens or kings? $103,000 pot. $40,000 to Antonius.
There's really only one hand he can get a call from here that he's in front, and that'd be Queen King. I can't imagine him re-raising this one.
Brian Townsend was the pre-flop raiser. He could have pocket queens, he could have pocket kings. And you're probably right. Nothing else would call a raise.
Phil Ivey watching on intently. For once, he's not the one getting beaten up in the pot. Looks like he's counting out a number of black chips in this pot. That looks like a raise.
Raise
Yeah, it's a big raise.
150,000.
He makes it $150,000.
I think Brian Townsend's just realised his hand's no good.
I was wondering if Brian Townsend actually wanted a call. He certainly didn't want that.
Where is it exactly?
And the pot is
$150,000
$250,000, $110,000 to call.
110 more.
Brian definitely not happy to see the raise there on the river.
He's reaching for his chips.
Wow, is he really going to call this? What hand can he beat? What hand would Antonius call the flop with, the turn with, and then raise the river with that he can beat?
What has he convinced himself that his opponent's got?
You wonder, he can't beat 7-8, and look at that, he calls! I cannot believe it. We have the biggest pot at the $1 Million Cash Game. $363,000.
So we were prepared to kill Brian Townsend for this call on the river, but then we did a really long podcast about it, and we talked a lot about what we think Brian Townsend is trying to do here, and we kind of don't hate it at all.
Right, so David Tuckman, who's the commentator in this hand, the non-British commentator here, asks, what does Townsend think Antonius is calling the flop, calling the turn, and check-raising the river with that Townsend can beat? And on the podcast, we actually came up with kind of a slew of hands, assuming that Antonius can check-raise bluff the river, which we know from other hands that have been televised that he can.
Right. If Antonius doesn't have the check-raise bluff in him or almost never does it, then this can't be a good call. But I believe Townsend is actually betting the river with the intention of calling a raise because he believes Antonius is check-raise bluffing sort of too much.
Right, I think that is possible. Let's first talk about the initial bet by Brian Townsend, which is a thin bet.
Super thin.
On it at first already.
Yeah.
So the straight, obviously, 7-8, which is the most likely draw, has come in. That's not great for Townsend.
Very bad.
But he really thinks that Antonius's range is a lot of one-pair hands that are worse than Townsend's one-pair hand. Townsend is not merging, and he's not bluffing here. This is a pure value bet when he bets $40,000 here.
Yeah, I mean, Townsend has got to be thinking, I believe, Antonius rarely has fives, he rarely has sixes, and he rarely has king-queen because he would expect Antonius to mostly raise those hands pre-flop. Antonius calls instead, which, now granted, Ivy had limped ahead of him, but still, Antonius is usually going to have more of the suited connector-type hands, which while 7-8 is one of those, other hands are in there too, like 4-5, 4-7, which while they make a pair on the river, sorry, 3-4 also, while they make, 4-5 is not a good one, but while they make one pair on the river, 3-4 and 4-7 do, they were open-enders that missed ultimately, and now maybe check-raising to win the pot because they feel like one pair isn't good enough.
Yeah, that is a very fair point, and on the turn, we ranged Antonius from Townsend's perspective, and that range included a lot of one-pair, 5s and 6s hands, sometimes a worse queen. And Townsend knows that his image is quite crazy, and he thinks that Antonius might make a hero call with a hand like that here, and that is clearly why he's betting. I don't think we can go as far as to say he's planning on calling a check raise, but he's prepared for that option, and he's ready to think it through and consider calling, not just insta-fold.
Yeah, I mean, if you think that Antonius's only real value holding here is 7-8, and he called like 85% of the pot on the turn out of position with just a straight draw, figure that doesn't happen that often. Although that does sort of also then count out 3-4 and 4-7, which I'm saying are part of Antonius'
right, all of those
range.
hands of hearts make a lot of sense for Antonius to
exactly, have. Exactly. He picks up the flush draw also.
Yeah. So sure, Townsend may be thinking that. At the same time, Antonius is a very good player who's able to get thin value in spots like this, obviously, because he raises $110,000 more with a set. And this is something we need to talk about as well, because this is a thin raise. Despite it being a set, which is clearly a good hand, there's not usually that much that Antonius can get called by, which is worse.
Yeah, these guys have got to have just so much history, both live and on the internet, for these guys to be able to make these plays and think that they're profitable, right? Because in theory, the only hands Townsend's supposed to be calling with are pocket kings, pocket queens, king queen, which is the one hand Antonius is beating, I guess, and pocket fives, which he's beating. That's it. Everything else, in theory, Antonius is losing to. But Antonius knows that he can make this play, and Townsend's going to call him thinner than that, so he can raise here.
Right. This is where the leveling war really comes into play. Like Jonathan mentioned, these guys have played a ton together, and the levels upon levels which they've played against each other, and they're both highly aggressive, active players, it creates this dynamic where value can be different than in a standard spot. Because in a standard spot, Antonius cannot expect to get called by aces, let alone second pair on the board.
And I mean, in a standard spot, you're never going to bet the queen on the river again when it's just queen jack. Right? You're going to check it back and assume you're good mostly, but know that you can almost never get value from it, right?
Yeah, the real question here is Townsend winning enough to make this call profitable? And we don't really know the answer, but we think it's a lot closer than we did when we first saw the hand.
Right. It's easy to say this is a terrible play because it looks so bad, but it's possible against this opponent and Townsend having the image that he has, this is actually perfectly fine play, and we can't really know without knowing all of their history.
That being said, Antonius got great value out of a set, which a lot of people would not have.
Yeah, I love that Antonius decided to check call all three streets against the super hyperactive internet whiz kid guy who's just going to barrel off most of the time instead of raising earlier on and usually killing his action.
Right. If Antonius were to raise the turn, Townsend probably finds a fold there.
Yeah, because the king comes, right?
Or at least folds on the river when Antonius bets again.
Agreed. It's much less likely he's going to get paid off, although I'm still surprised he paid him off.
Right. Anyway, really cool hand.
Great stuff. Don't go anywhere, because after this, we're going to look at user comments from last week's video.
If you guys want to see another river raise that results in an agonizing 9-minute decision, not that this was 9 minutes, but the one that I'm talking about is, check out Never Bluff Him Is Rocky by clicking here.
Definitely watch it just for the sweet, sweet pain. Also, make sure you check out our podcast and make sure you hit the subscribe button.
All right, guys. So on last week's show, we had a pro versus an amateur in the World Series main event, the pro being Roberto Romanello. And he made this really, really big fold on the river based on some live reads and some gameplay stuff. Let's hear what the people had to say.
Let's. All right, so first up on Reddit, Shanghai Dry, one of the cooler names on Reddit.
It's a type of haircut, we think.
We're going with haircut. Yeah. New players tend to be overconfident in their ability to use table talk and give off reverse tells. Unless you really know what you're doing, STFU, which is shut the fuck up, to be clear, and don't move, especially against a pro.
This is a great point. I completely agree with this guy, especially because he's got a great haircut called the Shanghai Dry.
Yeah.
Clearly, if you are at a disadvantage in any way, you should give away as little as possible. You have to be really 100% sure that you're the one gaining more from it if you decide to engage in any sort of table talk. And this guy definitely messed it up. Watch the video and find out.
Yeah, Geller definitely gives it away. And I believe Romanello probably calls if he just keeps his mouth shut and doesn't move. But he moves around a bunch. He says a bunch of things. None of them help him. It's a big mistake.
Right. Next on YouTube, we have kind of a dissenting opinion from ours. This is from Fabio Gaucho. I'm only going to read part of it because it's a very long comment. So he said, strange, I have a very different interpretation. He's talking about interpretation than us. I think Romanello had already decided he would fold to a raise, so all this talking was not about making a decision. I'm pretty sure he just wanted to commit Geller to show his cards after the fold, so that he, Romanello, could show everybody his big laydown. He succeeded in impressing Mattisau, who exclaimed, I could not have folded that. So there's more. He says a bit more. But the basic gist of it is Fabian Gaucho is saying that Romanello did this to brag, right?
I don't buy this for a second.
Yeah.
It's the World Series main event. It's a big river raise. Romanello's really trying to decide what to do. There's hands he can beat that this amateur could be raising for sure. He's trying to figure out where he is. And once the guy shows kings full, then he's going to turn over his jacks.
Sure.
But he's not engineering all of this to impress Mike Mattisau. First of all, nobody really likes Mattisau. And second of all, who cares if you impress Mike Mattisau? In terms of making a huge laydown, then people are just going to think they can go after you more.
For sure. The table talk certainly influenced Romanello, and I don't think you convince us otherwise. I mean, I don't think it's possible to convince me otherwise.
I mean, anything's possible.
Anyway, we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah.